You want to make Blade Runner. Amazing movie. And you actually have to, now you've got to show this movie at, an IMAX theater. It's got to be huge, huge. And you create these amazing visual effects. And you're immersed into this incredible environment. This is such an iconic scene from Blade Runner. And you're immersed into this environment that was created in Blade Runner. And you've got to make it realistic to show it that huge, huge size. Oh yeah, but don't forget, someone may also watch it like that. Now think of the challenge of having to produce and art direct a movie that's seen both at tens of meters, tens of whatever, really big, IMAX size, where you're immersed into that environment. And then at the same time recognize that some people are going to be watching it for the very first time in their hand. And so what happens actually is that narrative strategies and cinematic strategies shift. And we saw these shifts in the arrival of television. Think about how much of television takes place not outside, but actually in a room. Change the narrative space to accommodate the television. Well, it turns out that one of the things at this size that works very well, two things work very well at this size. One is animation, because it's kind of simple forms, they scale well. And the other is large heads. So if you look at the figure of the Japanese woman projected there, that's very visible and clear, but imagine trying to get immersed into that environment, much harder now. So animation and large heads. So I don't think it's a coincidence that about 2 years ago, actually about last year, MTV re-released Beavis and Butthead, which consists primarily of simple animation and large heads. And actually, what's the funnier part about this is that I made this slide, sad to admit, probably 4 years ago, long before MTV re-released Beavis and Butthead, but I'm convinced that the reason they re-released Beavis and Butthead is because it's perfect for this screen. Or maybe they saw my lecture on YouTube and realized this is the time to bring back Beavis and Butthead. I'm not sure. But animation and large heads. So as you shift in scale, the narrative forms, the art-directed forms, the scenographic forms change. This is another example that I really love. So this is a traffic intersection in Holland. And there's a well-known, recently deceased traffic engineer in Holland named Hans Monderman, who was asked to come in and help with this increasingly dense, increasingly accident-prone intersection. And so most traffic engineers, in addressing that kind of issue, would start to look at that and say, okay, well, if the problem is too many accidents, people go too fast, out of control, then obviously things you need a few more signs, just to, better signage, more signage, clearer signage, that's the solution. Because if you do that, people will slow down, they'll see what's happening and they'll know what's going on. But the brilliance of Hans Monderman was actually to go in exactly the opposite way. He removed everything. Almost everything. And so rather than saying, if the problem is large, we have a large solution. If the problem is even larger, we have an even larger solution. Get a bigger hammer if the problem's bigger. He actually inverted and reframed the problem altogether. And he changed the nature of what went on in that intersection. And the great thing about it, so you can see, they're not very well made, but there are some nice interviews with him on YouTube. But his favorite thing when he became kind of semi-famous for this approach to traffic engineering. And the way that he loved to illustrate the virtue of his approach was that he would close his eyes, he'd be with like an interviewer or a reporter, he would close his eyes and walk backwards into the intersection. Okay, and so he'd go like this into the intersection. And what he wanted to demonstrate was that the problem shifted from one of drivers paying attention to signage, to instructions, to being effectively quite dumb in how they navigate an intersection, to now one of being social choreography. That people now had to look at each other, they had to find out what someone was doing, they had to give each other space. It became a set of social interactions that helped to navigate this space rather than a set of signage. So from a one-way communication to a sort of two-way communication system. And he could walk backwards with his eyes closed into the intersection because people were paying attention. They were expecting the unexpected. And so rather than taking a problem that's getting worse and worse and applying a bigger and bigger hammer with more and more force, he just discovered that actually much less is different. And so it's a fascinating example. And overall, volume in this intersection has increased, accidents have decreased. And this is being taken on in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and other places across the world now. And here are some of his kind of instructions. This was a diagram by Wired magazine in our discussion. But you remove signs, you install some artwork, you share the spotlight, so get people and cars well illuminated. You do it in the road, upper right-hand quadrant. In other words, you bring cafes kind of into the road, you eliminate curbs. So it really is sort of taking away almost everything that we know within an intersection in order to recreate a very different kind of problem space or solution. So here's another example. In this one I cleverly refer to as the Internet Inverse Feedback Phenomenon, or IIF is my acronym for it. And it hasn't caught on. I've been trying to make this go viral now for like 3 years. It still hasn't, but I'm still working at it. Today might be the day. But it's pretty simple, and I think you've all experienced it. So, you know, if you're going online and you're trying to, say, buy a camera, or you want to go for a trip. My family and I wanted to go for a trip to Mexico, so we needed a place to stay, so we went on TripAdvisor. It's all user-generated content. And the interesting thing about user-generated content was, in the early days of the internet, for those of us who were alive then, sites that had user-generated content were really unreliable because most of it was kind of cranks who were posted their reviews of things. So it was just kind of, you know, people who wanted attention, people who wanted to kind of be excessive in their comments, etc. So the information was basically pretty useless. But then, as more and more people started to get online, these user-generated sites reached a kind of sweet spot in their size, in their scale, in their usage, where you really got great information about all sorts of different things, about kind of camera to buy, you know, sort of where to go in a city, all these kinds of things. But then I think we've moved to a point now where this system of user-generated content and reviewing has had so many people that it's broken. The problem has changed. I'll give you an example of that. So a few years ago, we were looking to stay in Mexico. So I was looking at this one place called Posada del Sol, and this was a review that I read. Oh my God, amazing, amazing, amazing. I knew this place would be beautiful, but pictures do not do justice for Posada del Sol. Also, I was kind of skeptical because of a recent review below, but we just stuck with our reservation to hope for the best. So glad we did. Being there in person is way better, and it surpassed my expectations. It's amazing. The hotel itself is beautiful, and the beach is amazing. It's on this more or less private cove with just a few people on the beach. Some days, my boyfriend and I would have the beach to ourselves. We kept the windows open every night to let the breeze from the sea in and refresh the room. Never had problems with bugs or mosquitoes because there was a lot of breeze. The sounds of the waves lulled you to sleep. Perfect. It's exactly what we wanted. The only problem was, go a little bit further, and you read this. Warning, worst hotel experience ever. I was supposed to stay at Posada del Sol for 2 nights and booked over internet. Here are some of the problems that were with this property that I did not anticipate, nor was I warned of. No privacy in the room. Drapes do not cover windows that look out onto the main road. Dirty and stained bed linens and towels. Getting a little worse. No electricity at night. I had to go out and sleep in the back seat of my car. Now that's a good hotel. You know you're in a good hotel when you go sleep in the back of your car. No screen on the window in the bathroom to keep bugs out, and there was an exposed outlet with wires hanging out of it in the shower. It's actually not on the beach, and the beach it is across from is very small and crowded, shared by at least 2 other hotels, all of which actually give their guests beach towels. And here is the part that I find the most confounding. I've stayed at 5-star hotels as well as hostels and B&Bs, and I don't mind roughing it. This was way beyond roughing it though. It was positively awful. Please, if you want to actually enjoy your vacation, do not plan on staying here. So it's reached a scale now where this happens over and over. The system is completely broken. Because there are eminently reasonable examples or sort of expressions of why something's great, and eminently reasonable explanations of why this is the worst possible that you can experience. And there's no, just try and buy a camera online and read reviews. I dare you. You will not find a camera that isn't described as the best and the worst for any number of reasons. I'm going to skip this more freer and move on, finally, to this kind of scale framing as a sort of design exercise. So how do we leverage these weird qualities of scale? How do we start to think about the transformation in scale and the way the problems shift, to then think about how design can deal with complexity and scale? So what I want to do is I want to borrow an example. I want to borrow sort of an approach from the Eames, and I want to give you an example of bicycling in the city. And in fact, let me start at 10 to the 0 scale, rather than 10 to the 1 as I often do. So 10 to the 0 scale, part of the thing with bicycling is having clothes. Now I saw James come in his bicycle clothing today, and probably in his bicycle shoes on a rainy day. Part of the challenge of a design, if you want to increase bicycle riding in the city, part of the challenge is dealing with how do you deal with the clothes that you wear. They get dirty, they get wet, hard to translate. How do you go to a meeting when you have to look nice, if you got to be on your bike, what kind of bag you carry, etc. So 10 to the power of 1, it's almost a kind of fashion design problem. 10 to the power of 0, excuse me. 10 to the power of 1, you might look at the bicycle and you say, well, part of the reason people don't bicycle is the bicycles are hard to kind of carry around in the city. If we had a foldable, lightweight, easy to carry bicycle, a lot more people might actually bicycle in the city. So 10 to the power of 1, you move from a kind of fashion design problem at 10 to the power of 0 to a product design problem at 10 to the power of 1, sort of at the scale of your human interactions, let's say. But if you move out, as the Eames do, to 10 to the power of 2, the problem changes, and you realize part of the reason people don't bicycle is not because their bicycles are insufficient, but in fact it's because the roads are hazardous. You have to manage and account for skateboards, scooters, bicycles, rickshaws, motorcycles, cars, buses, and on and on and on, pedestrians, baby carriages, all of which are moving through this space in a way that wasn't designed for them. So 10 to the power of 2, you realize the problem shifts not for people, the problem of why people don't bicycle is not a problem of the bicycle itself, but actually of the streetscape. It's an urban design problem. It's change. And at 10 to the power of 3, it becomes an architecture problem. Let's say we all had bicycles. We have there are tiny apartments in New York. Where do you put all these bicycles? Where do you park them at night? How do you manage them in a city as dense as this? So 10 to the power of 3, the problem changes to one of almost an architectural scale of thinking about how you manage all those bicycles. And if you move out to 10 to the power of 4, you realize that what may really make a difference with people bicycling is actually to create a bike share system. That might really increase the amount of bicycle riding, as many cities have done. New York has started to. So 10 to the power of 4, the design problem shifts, now becomes one of service design. How do you create a service where people can pick up a bike here and drop it there? It doesn't matter really how the bike, what the shape of the bike is. And if you've seen bike services around the world, the bikes are all a little different. It doesn't really matter. But how you integrate with that system as a foreigner, as a local, how do you use that system in a way that's more convenient than a car or taxi, is a service design problem. So the problem shifts again at 10 to the power of 4. At 10 to the power of 5, and you're now thinking, well, I live out in the New Jersey suburbs, but I want to ride my bike to work. And I have to take the PATH train, then I have to take maybe the subway for some part of it, and then I ride my bike. You're now looking at systems integration. How do you deal with these different metropolitan authorities, none of whom communicate very effectively to each other, and manage the smooth flow of your bicycle and you across these different systems? It's a systems design problem as you get to the sort of regional level, 10 to the power of 5. At 10 to the power of 6, you might ask, why isn't bicycling more popular? And you would start to realize at 10 to the power of 6 at the federal level, It's that we subsidize automobile travel. We disincentivize bicycle travel. So we make more roads, we make wider roads. But we don't subsidize, we don't encourage bicycle riding. So if you wanted to increase the amount of bicycle riding at the federal level, you realize this is kind of a policy design issue. It's not a service design, it's not a systems design, it's not an industrial design problem, it's a policy level problem. And at 10 to the power of 7, you might ask, well, what happens if we make all these bicycles? What's actually the global implication of bicycle manufacturing? What is the carbon footprint? What is the ecological footprint of all that bicycle manufacturing? Where do the metals come from? Where do the parts come from? The components, the raw materials. What do we do when the bicycles are no longer working? We used to have dead horses in cities. That was a problem. Maybe dead bicycles would become a problem. And moreover, it helps you then to think, well, maybe there's a way to manufacture bicycles locally. You use bamboo. Where do you get rubber? You can't get rubber locally. It's hard to get rubber locally. So you might think about micro-scale, hyper-local production, distributed manufacture. How can you now, if you wanted to address bicycling and still think at a global level, at a global scale, you might now start to reframe the problem as one of distributed manufacturing production. And the point is that as you move across scales, the problem and the opportunity changes. And if you want to create large-scale change, what you need to think about is something that happens in ecosystems more than in mechanical systems. And that is where small perturbations, small changes, cascade into large systemic shifts. And we know this usually through negative examples within ecosystems. So for example, if you introduce an invasive predator into an ecosystem, as they often do, seem to always do in California, because you want to take out one kind of animal or insect, then you create a brand new problem. Or let's use another example. That if you, the problem of algae moving from kind of one body of water to another. And when it moves into, certain kinds of algae move into lakes, they start to absorb all the oxygen in the lake. They grow, reproduce really fast. Because they're invasive, they were never meant to be there. And suddenly they kill the lake or the pond. They take the oxygen out of the system. That's a sort of small perturbation, a small disruption in the system, introduction of one small species, but it creates a cascading systemic level effect. But can we turn that the other way? That's the question here. If we need to change these systems, can we make small changes that can cascade across and make larger changes? And as a designer, what you need to do is anytime you're addressing a problem, and for all problems that are always local and global, is that you don't need to operate at all levels. That would be impossible. But instead what you need to do is to think about the level that you can be most effective at. And so if you're a product designer, you're kind of on your own, then maybe making better bicycles is the best solution that you'll be able to have an impact on. But if you're that same person, but you also have some friends who happen to be in policy and have influence in Albany or Washington, then maybe it becomes a policy level problem that you need to think about. How do you leverage all that activity at the policy level to change policy impact at a different scale? And so any problem, I believe, in order to deal with the complexity, you need to sort of slice it into these scales. And hopefully, that provides some way in which you can, in changing the scale, you can change the nature of the problem. Thank you.
We've actually got some time left, so if anybody wanted to talk to Jen, ask any question, make some points. If it's very out of time, we can try and talk a lot of very concrete.
I tried to talk a little faster.
Anybody? Yeah.
One of the things that I alluded to before, in thinking about this kind of temporal scale, was I was, one of the interesting things that I was reading this morning for class on Friday was thinking in terms of biological time. the ways in which we've been able to shift the scale of the production of certain kinds of either species or agricultural products. And then as you change those, you start to get 2 harvests in a year rather than 1, as you start to get 3 harvests rather than 2, as you start to increase the reproductive qualities of certain livestock, that what you get is not just increased production over that kind of temporal scale, but you also introduce new kinds of viruses, disease, erosion, things that actually end up killing the system. So that hyperproductivity, increasing the kind of temporality of how frequently you do things, actually changes the problem at some point. You get to a point where no longer can that system sort of survive that kind of change. So that's next year. Yeah.
What was the more is freer point? You deliberately passed over that?
Yeah, so that was Chris Anderson a few years ago released a book called Free. And the idea was that the book would be free. What he was trying to get at was the fact that our economy had shifted in such bizarre ways that free could now be monetized. You could make money from free, as many websites have. So, for example, most of you probably don't know, maybe Ed does, that Netscape, you used to have to buy Netscape, the browser, a long time ago. And then at one point they made a decision that Netscape would be free. Imagine that. You used to like package your product, put it on in boxes, put it on trucks, have it go to a store, and people would purchase it. And then your business model suddenly becomes, well, actually, no, we have to give it away. That's our business model. It's a bit radical in terms of a shift. But they recognized that there was a different economic opportunity in the sort of proliferation of a free Netscape as opposed to a non-free one. You know, Google has been much better at this. Netscape has died, more or less. But the idea was that you can, you can start to sort of gain more value, more money from something that's actually free. So, just read you this quote. The entirety of Chris Anderson's book, Free, is currently available free on the online service Scribd and at Google Books. The not quite practicing what it preaches rub, it's free to read online, but not to print or download. So you can read it, but you can't print it or download it. What you can get for free is a downloadable 9-page excerpt and a complete audiobook. The abridged audiobook is on sale for $7.49. No, I don't get the logic of that either. So you can get the whole audiobook for free, or you can get a smaller part for more. And so what was interesting about that moment in Chris Anderson's book was, I mean, it's this kind of the French call it mise en abîme, this like mirror, mirrors of mirrors of mirrors kind of thing, is that he was kind of entering the world of free value and the value that comes from free, the monetization of free, and yet like couldn't figure out how exactly to even orient a kind of value within that system. And so it's, I think, a really interesting example of an economy where the scale and connected to value becomes completely sort of dislodged from any of the mechanisms of scarcity, of quantity, and even of certain relationships.
Okay.
Put a fork in it.
Thanks, Jenna.
My pleasure.